Chapter 7 Disaster 1. The retreat from Kharkov to Rostov. I went to Taganrog on November, although I was still ill after a violent attack of fever. I went straight from the station to the commander-in-chief, who said abruptly, "I beg you to take the command of the volunteer army." I replied that I now doubted whether I should be of any use in this position. Everything that I had suggested hitherto must now go by the board. We could not even count on holding Kharkov, the crux of our strategical position. He interrupted me. "I see what you mean quite clearly, but the loss of Kharkov will not injure your reputation." I told him somewhat dryly that I was not thinking about my reputation, for it did not need safeguarding, but about doing my job. I did not want to undertake what I believed was an impossible task. "Your refusal," said Romanovsky, "puts the commander-in-chief in a dilemma. We are going to concentrate all the cavalry of the volunteer army and the army of the Don in the Kupiansk area, and nobody but you can take the command. You are under a moral obligation to serve Russia." I asked for time before giving a definite answer. I returned to my train and found Chatilov, my chief of staff, who had already received all the necessary information from headquarters. We set about studying the situation. It was indeed desperate. Our front was 2,000 kilometers long, beginning on the Volga and ending at Odessa. Our effective forces, including the Cossacks, numbered 100,000 men, while there were 30,000 more at the depot. The Red forces numbered 180,000, and they had huge reserves. The Volunteer Army's infantry numbered only 2,600, and its cavalry was reduced to 1,000 men. These had to face 51,000 foot and 7,000 horse. The Supreme General Staff was basing all its hopes on the concentration of cavalry at Kupiansk. The Terek and the Kuban regiments there had suffered very heavily, but the Don regiments were still intact and well mounted. The ill-fated advance on Moscow was still going on and was tying the hands of the High Command. Peasant revolts were raging behind the lines in the governments of Ekaterinoslav, Poltava, and Kharkov, and Makhno and his bands were molesting the troops. General Chatilov agreed with me that the situation was hopeless. The next day, General Romanovsky, accompanied by the Quartermaster General, returned to the charge. He said, "General Maymayevsky cannot hold out any longer. He has completely lost his head." I interrupted him. "Everyone knew that a long time ago, except Supreme Headquarters. I warned you of the danger 100 times when there was still time to avert it, but every time you turned a deaf ear. And now that the danger has materialized, you expect me to save you." "Let us forget the past, General," said Romanovsky. "Let us think only of the future. Make this sacrifice for Russia." "If I do, it must be on my own terms. I reserve the right to choose my colleagues, especially my chief of staff." The general agreed to everything I said. The following day, I presented myself to the commander-in-chief. As I left him, I asked him who was going to take my place as commander of the Caucasian Army. "General Pokrovsky, what do you think of him?" he replied. "He is very brave and very intelligent," I said, "but he has not the necessary qualities for the commander of an army." The general smiled. "Once we have taken his cavalry away from him, his army will be no larger than a company. Only since you are taking Chatilov with you, I do not know who to give him for his chief of staff. What do you think about General Siegel?" "An excellent man by all accounts." "Honest?" "Of course. If he was not, I should not have kept him as quartermaster." "Splendid. Then he will not let General Pokrovsky do too much pilfering." I began to lose all understanding of my chief's mentality. On November 25th, I left for Kharkov, taking a few officers with me, in addition to my chief of staff. The further north we went, the greater the general confusion seemed to be. The railway stations were choked with trains evacuating infinite numbers of refugees, including many perfectly able-bodied soldiers. These trains were full of the belongings of different regiments. I saw sentinels on guard before one train. I saw some officers in a Pullman car. I sent one of my aides-de-camp to ask what regiment they belonged to. He discovered that nearly every regiment had its trains on the railway. All the troops were living on the population, often requisitioning far more than they needed and selling the surplus. In addition, Some of these regiments had 200 carriages reserved for the transport of their baggage. The stations were swarming with refugees, mostly women and children, some ill, some starving, some in the last straits. Maevsky's train passed ours. He had already left the army. In one of the stations, we found several ambulance trains, which had been there for days awaiting an opportunity to move on. Not far from the station, there was a hospital, destitute of staff, drugs, and nurses. In it were several dozen wounded, utterly destitute and literally dying of hunger. A few of them had dragged themselves into the street in search of a scrap of bread. My arrival became known, and two of these poor wretches crawled over to my carriage and implored me to help them. They told me that one of the officers there had just hanged himself in despair. At the principal points on the railway, I left bands of soldiers with generals or colonels with plenary powers at their head. They were to search all the trains going to the front, seize stolen objects, send back deserters to their regiments, and shoot recalcitrants and marauders. Staff officers were to supervise the regular running of the trains. The dispatches from the cavalry generals were hopeless. They can be summed up in the words, "For the moment, it is impossible for the cavalry to fight." My dispatch to the commander-in-chief, which I quote in full, gives a more or less complete picture of the situation at the seat of war. Dispatch to the Commander-in-Chief. Yuzovka No 10464, December 9, 1919. I arrived here November 26th, and having acquainted myself with the situation along the principal section of the front, I have the honor to make the following communication to you. Our disadvantageous position at the present time has two principal causes. One, a strategy diametrically opposed to the rudiments of the art of warfare. Two, complete disorganization behind the lines. In my dispatch No. 82 of April 4, 1919, I felt it my duty, whilst insisting on the advance on Tsaritsyn, to draw your attention to the impossibility of simultaneous action in several directions whilst we lacked the necessary forces. After we had taken Tsaritsyn, General Yusefovich and I sent you two dispatches in which we indicated the necessity of occupying the short Tsaritsyn-Ekaterinoslav front, which is defended on both its flanks by large rivers, and of concentrating 3 or 4 cavalry corps in the Kharkov area for operations along the shortest route to Moscow. This plan, to quote your own remark at our interview in Tsaritsyn, was only dictated by my desire to be the first man to enter Moscow. When the enemy recently concentrated considerable forces near Orel and began to put pressure on the volunteer army, General Romanovsky asked me on October 17th for some troops to reinforce our front line. I telegraphed on October 18th that, in view of the reduction in the effective force of the cavalry, the problem could not be solved by sending 1 or 2 troops, and suggested a radical measure, the sending of 3.5 Kuban divisions. My suggestion was turned down, and a hybrid measure was adopted. Only 2 divisions were taken from the Caucasian army. Later events compelled a return to the measure I had suggested. 3.5 divisions have now been taken from the Caucasian army, but the time that has been lost is irreparable. We wanted to do too much and make ourselves master of every position at once, and we have succeeded only in weakening ourselves and so becoming powerless. The Bolshevists, on the contrary, have held firmly to the principle of the concentration of forces and the launching of operations against our strongest point. When the Caucasian array's advance on Saratov threatened the Bolshevists' eastern front, the Red Command let our troops advance on Kursk and Orel with perfect equanimity, inexorably following the plan of concentration at Saratov, followed by a great mass attack which would shatter the Caucasian army and throw it back to the south, weakened as it was by a 1,000-kilometer march and the sending of some troops to other fronts. It was only when the remains of the Caucasian army retreated to Tsaritsyn, powerless now to undertake a fresh offensive, that the Red Command, uniting its forces for the defense of Moscow, began operations against the volunteer army, which was advancing without reserves along an enormously long front, and turned it back. In spite of the transport crisis and other difficulties, the Red Command have carried out the principle of the concentration of forces in its entirety. We have been advancing continuously, but have taken no steps to consolidate our possession of the immense territories we have conquered. We have made mistakes from the Sea of Azov to Orel. We have not a single fortified position nor a point of attack. Therefore, if we have to retreat, we shall have not a single place on which to fall back. The continual advance has reduced the army's effective force. The rear has become too vast. Disorganization is all the greater because of the re-equipment system which Supreme Headquarters have adopted. They have turned over this duty to the troops and take no share in it themselves. Headquarters ought to provide and distribute all necessaries, making use of all the spoils of war for this purpose. The war is becoming to some a means of growing rich. Re-equipment has degenerated into pillage and peculation. Each unit strives to secure as much as possible for itself and seizes everything that comes to hand. What cannot be used on the spot is sent back to the interior and sold at a profit. The rolling stock belonging to the troops has taken on enormous dimensions. Some regiments have 200 carriages in their wake. A considerable number of troops have retreated to the interior, and many officers are away on prolonged missions, busy selling and exchanging loot, etc. The army is absolutely demoralized and is fast becoming a collection of tradesmen and profiteers. All those employed on re-equipment work, that is to say, nearly all the officers, have enormous sums of money in their possession. As a result, there has been an outbreak of debauchery, gambling, and wild orgies. Unfortunately, several highly placed officers have set the example of costly banquets and have spent money lavishly for all the army to see. Our badly organized police and counter-espionage systems are a great help to the Bolshevist agitators in their subversive work behind the lines. Each of these two systems works independently of the other. The officials are both underpaid and unsuitable. As a result of the inadequacy of their salaries, the most indispensable of the railway officials quitted their posts when the Bolshevists arrived and went over to the enemy. The population greeted our army with wild enthusiasm. They have all suffered from the Bolshevists and only want to be allowed to live in peace, and yet they have to endure the horrors of pillage, violence, and despotism all over again. Result: confusion at the front and risings in the interior. When I arrived here, Kharkov had already been abandoned by the general staff, and the army was in full retreat. The evacuation has been conducted disastrously, without plan or order. None of the institutions were given directions concerning the route they were to take, nor even concerning their destination. Everybody merely wandered off anyhow. I found the railroads blocked by trains and abandoned ambulances without any staff, but full of sick and wounded who had eaten nothing for 3 days. When I reached Slavyansk, a wounded officer had just hanged himself rather than endure the tortures of starvation. Crowds of refugees, mostly officers' families, are cramming themselves into all the trains and stations. No steps are being taken to evacuate them, and they are literally dying of cold and hunger. On the road between Zmiev and Izium, behind the lines, local bands are destroying the railroads, molesting the troops, and robbing the ambulances and luggage vans. I find that our forces have diminished. The 1st Corps has about 2,600 men, the 5th, 1,015 cavalrymen, the Poltava group musters 100 foot and 200 horse, the cavalry troop is about 3,500 strong. Total, 3,600 foot, 4,700 horse. The Kuban Corps is a mere brigade. Kornilov's regiments are only battalions. Markov's 2 regiments and the Special Brigade have only their cadres left and are out of action. Of Drostovsky's division, only 3 companies are left. The troops refuse to use the tanks because they are afraid of losing them. The artillery is no longer of any use. The enemy have 51,000 foot, 7,000 horse, and more than 206 guns. Behind the lines, we have only the remains of Alexeyev's division, 300 men all told. The army has been on the march for months, without respite or rest, and is utterly exhausted. The horses have developed foot disease. Therefore, we have often been forced to discard guns and equipment. The condition of the cavalry is simply lamentable. The horses have not been shod for a long while and have nearly all gone lame. whilst many of them are ill from exhaustion. Most of the units are out of action, as their commanders can witness. The bitter truth is that there is no longer an army. Measures are being taken to restore order to the interior, bases are being organized, all the available contingents are being mobilized, but all these measures have come too late, and it will take a long time to create a new army. The enemy realize this and are doing their utmost to exploit their successes in every possible way. We must have the courage to see things as they are, to look the situation squarely in the face, and be ready for fresh ordeals. I consider it indispensable. 1. To adhere to a definite plan, that is to say, to choose one principal direction in which to concentrate our forces, and to be ready to abandon part of the occupied area if it should be necessary. 2. To evacuate Rostov and Taganrog at once. 3. To choose bases behind the lines and fortify them. 4. To cut down the overlarge general staffs and send the surplus and useless personnel to the front. 5. To provide the necessaries of life for the families of officers and employees who cannot do their work properly until they know that their wives and children are safely out of misery and danger, and to organize colonies immediately for the families of officers and officials so that these families can be provided with food and shelter. Arrangements must be made to transport them to a place of safety in case of danger. 6. To take measures, ruthless if necessary, to put down marauding, drunkenness, and every kind of abuse, and to begin with the higher ranks, whose bad example is corrupting the troops, whatever their military worth may be. 7. To provide reinforcements of men and horses, to re-equip the cavalry, or this branch of the army will be worthless. I have written many dispatches on this last point, but all in vain. The matter is extremely urgent. The enemy are using all their resources to create large cavalry units. Our cavalry was established and recruited without any kind of system, and it will soon fall to pieces altogether. 8. To put the counter-espionage organization and the police force in order, to amalgamate them, and to furnish them with sufficient credits. 9. To put the railways under military control, and to subordinate the head officials to the chief of military communications. At the same time, to guarantee a regular living wage to the employees. To sum up, unless the above measures are put into force, it is impossible to improve our situation. Moreover, unless they can be put in hand immediately, I must request you to transfer the command of the volunteer army to someone else, for without them, I can accomplish nothing. Lieutenant General Wrangel, Chatalov, Chief of Staff. I delivered this dispatch to the Commander-in-Chief myself and sent a copy of it to his 2 colleagues, Generals Lukomsky and Romanovsky, begging them to urge as swift a decision as possible. General Denikin crossed over to the light and began to read it. When he had done so, he put it down on the table without a word and looked at us despairingly. Then he said dully, "All the same, we must go on with it." "Of course, Your Excellency, and do our utmost to win the upper hand. But before we do anything else, we must come to a decision. The enemy are operating between the volunteer army and the army of the Don, and want to drive me down to the sea. Our cavalry is no longer capable of fighting. If you order us to retreat to Rostov and join the army of the Don, we shall have to retreat with the enemy striking blows at our flanks the whole time. If, on the other hand, we retreat into the Crimea, where we still have some troops." The general broke in. "I have been thinking it over for a long time, and I must follow the dictates of my conscience. I have not the moral right to abandon the Cossacks to their fate. We must retreat together." He asked a few unimportant questions and then dismissed us. Chatalov and I walked along in silence. "What is your opinion?" I asked him. Chatalov shrugged his shoulders. "They have lost their heads. They are no good for anything now." I could not forget the tragic expression on Denikin's face as he read my report. He had to watch the work into which he had put his whole strength collapse in an instant. It was certainly terrible for him. If he was to look the calamity in the face and still keep his sanity, he must know that he was not bearing this burden which fate had thrust upon him alone. It was essential that he should have the moral support of his closest colleagues. So I wrote to him, "Your Excellency, At this moment, when luck is against us, when the ship which you are piloting between the rocks and the storm is in danger of submersion by the foul red waves, I feel morally obliged to tell you that I understand what you must be suffering. If at this crucial moment it lightens the load with which circumstances have burdened you, to know that you are not alone, please believe that I, who have followed you almost from the beginning, will continue to share your joys and sorrows and will do everything within my power to help you. P. Wrangel, December 10th, 1919. Some days later, the general wrote to me, December 13th, 1919. Your letter touched me very deeply. Your collaboration and your sentiments lead me to hope that our luck will turn. I know that it will turn. Your heart's cry has found an echo in mine, and I wish you luck and success. P.S. Some of your proposals have been carried out, the rest are in hand. But at the same time, I learned that nothing had been done about the evacuation of Rostov and Taganrog. Furthermore, on the same day that I received the Commander-in-Chief's friendly letter, I also received a circular telegram which he had addressed to all the generals of the army. It said that certain generals had allowed themselves to express their own opinions in their dispatches in an inadmissible manner, threatening to leave the service if their advice was not followed. In consequence, the Commander-in-Chief demanded obedience and forbade any future statement of conditions. Supreme Headquarters' new instructions ordered the Chief of the Army of the Don and myself to concentrate as strong a force as possible on the junction of our flanks and to attack the enemy's cavalry. I spoke to General Sidorin, commander of the Army of the Don. As soon as I received these new orders, I said to him, "My troops, and I have practically none left, are in such a condition that I cannot possibly resume the offensive in concert with you. I am not even sure that I can manage to effect a junction with your army, as I have been ordered to do, unless you can give me a helping hand." "Yes, Supreme Headquarters have evidently failed to grasp the situation," said Sidorin. "I have petitioned them in vain, but have received no explicit reply. Only yesterday, my Chief of Staff asked General Romanovsky for information, and he answered, 'When the commander of your army sees the commander of the volunteer army, the two of them will be able to concoct something.'" As I had to go to Rostov shortly, I arranged with Sidorin that he should come and meet me there. I also said that I wanted the commander of the Caucasian army to come along and help us settle certain questions. I informed General Romanovsky of this by telegram, so that the commander-in-chief could authorize the commander of the Caucasian army to go to Rostov for a few hours. His reply was a circular letter addressed to all the generals of the army, running as follows. "The commander-in-chief cannot permit the generals of the armies to treat directly with one another, and forbids them to leave their armies in future without his express permission." The front was drawing nearer and nearer to Rostov, and there was keen anxiety in the town. There were open complaints against the commander-in-chief. He was accused of having been responsible for the catastrophe. The malcontents shouted that he must be overthrown. As all such remarks invariably found their way to Denikin, I attributed the circular telegram to them and decided to have a frank discussion with him. I went to Taganrog. The commander-in-chief received me alone, without even his chief of staff. After I had made my report, he told me that he had decided to reduce the volunteer army to a single corps once its junction with the Army of the Don was accomplished. To avoid offending the Cossacks, he would be compelled to give the command of these troops to Sidorin, chief of the Army of the Don. As he attempted to be more explicit, needless though this was, for I thought he was perfectly right, I told him that I shared his opinion completely, and in the circumstances I was ready to take any post he liked. If I cannot be useful to the army, perhaps I could go into the rear or abroad. No, we need you here." "Your Excellency," I said, "may I speak quite frankly to you? I believe that I no longer enjoy your confidence. Dare I ask the reason?" "What do you mean?" he asked. "You are quite mistaken. I have always had the greatest confidence in you, but you have not reciprocated it. You have done everything you could to poison our relations. You have written to me in such a way that I have had to hide your dispatches from my colleagues. Have I ever been anything but correct in my dealings with you? Your Excellency, you are forgetting your last circular telegram forbidding the army chiefs to make arrangements with one another. How can you explain that, except by a lack of confidence in their loyalty? As to my dispatches, they were absolutely necessary under the circumstances. I could not possibly have acted in a way which would have injured my troops. The general got up. Let us say no more about it. He held out his hand, but I knew that we had not come to terms and that our interview had been fruitless. He merely wanted to put an end to a disagreeable conversation. In the middle of December, after a march of 300 kilometers, during which the enemy was on our flank the whole time, we at last effected our junction with the Army of the Dawn. We had carried out our orders and made an extraordinarily difficult retreat, of which any army would have been proud. Once the junction of the armies was effected, my task was finished, so on December 19th, late at night, I reached Taganrog. The depots were on fire, the station full of refugees. Headquarters had left in great haste without waiting for the completion of the evacuation, which had been begun too late. The townsfolk, in a panic, were fleeing in carts and on foot. An English officer found me. He told me that Supreme Headquarters had broken their promise and left without taking with them the staff and archives of the English mission. I suggested taking the mission in my train, but there was no room for all the archives, and the mission felt they had no right to abandon them. I promised to send them a train from Rostov, and I did so. I found the commander-in-chief's train at Rostov, the commander of the Army of the Don, and the Ataman of Kuban were also there. The commander-in-chief invited us into his carriage. We had not been there a moment when the English General Holman was announced. He was asked to come in. He told us that he had just received a telegram from his government which declared that it was ready to help with the evacuation and give its protection to the families of military men, the sick and the wounded. When he had gone, the commander-in-chief acquainted us with the situation and gave us our orders. The troops were to be concentrated in a fortified place chosen for the purpose. He added that since the fortifications were merely sketched out, their value was purely psychological. The volunteer army was henceforth to be an army corps, incorporated in Sidorin's army. I was to go to Kuban and the Terek to try and raise some troops. I asked General Denikin's permission to take General Chadilov with me, and he gave it. I prepared to leave the next day. I was assailed on all sides throughout that day. The town was in a state of panic. Some people begged me to take them with me. Others wanted to know why I was giving up my command. Others again complained of Supreme Headquarters. Rumors of sedition reached the commander-in-chief, and he, believing them, had the intelligence department's documents seized and several of its employees arrested. One of the officers denounced General Lukomsky, adjutant to the commander-in-chief, asserting that he was at the head of the conspiracy against Denikin. It was soon proved that all these fears were absolutely unfounded, but, nevertheless, the informer remained at his post, a confidential one, under Romanovsky. At this moment of imminent peril, Denikin continued to busy himself with purely theoretical questions. On December 11th, he issued the following program. One Russia, one and indivisible, protection of religion, re-establishment of order, increase in the productive powers of the country and reorganization of national economy, greater productivity of labor. 2. War to the death with Bolshevism. 3. A military dictatorship. This government will ignore the demands of all political parties and will crush any resistance to its authority, be it from right or left. The nature of the government can only be decided later by the people themselves. We must act in accordance with the people, a complete agreement with the Cossacks without injury to the sovereignty of Russia, rallying of Transcaucasia to Russia. 4. Foreign policy will be national, Russian first and foremost. Although the Allies are wavering, we must continue to move with them. Any other grouping is morally censurable and impossible of realization. 5. Slav solidarity, but not an inch of Russian territory to win help. A cabinet was constituted on December 17th. It consisted of 8 members, including the president, a minister of war, and the admiralty, and ministers of finance, the interior, commerce, justice, transport, and supplies. The Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Comptroller General were not in the cabinet, but were directly dependent on the Commander-in-Chief. A consultative committee for legislative questions was also set up. Second with the army in its last days, when I reached Ekaterinodar with Chatilov, I found that the object of my mission was already well known. The Cossacks were well disposed towards me, but Naumenko told me that the opposition were making themselves heard. The struggle between the Kuban separatists and Supreme Headquarters had begun again. On January 2nd, a meeting of the Supreme Union of Cossacks was to take place. The union consisted of 150 representatives from the Don, the Kuban, and the Terek, and it was meeting to draw up a constitution for a federated Cossack state. I was disagreeably surprised to meet General Chkoro in the Kuban and to discover that he was there on the same mission as I. The commander-in-chief had also sent him to raise fresh troops. He was accompanied by a staff officer assigned to him by Supreme Headquarters and a few aides-de-camp and orderly officers, including 2 agents from the intelligence department who General Romanovsky had tried to foist on me, but for whom I had no use. I soon learnt that these 2 creatures had been secretly entrusted with the task of informing headquarters of my actions and movements. They went about telling all those who cared to listen that I was hoping to make a coup d'etat and re-establish the monarchy, and that I was an enemy of the Allies and a partisan of Germany. Under these conditions, I could not possibly accomplish my mission. Therefore, I restricted myself to collecting the necessary materials, and having done this, made for headquarters, fully determined to insist on my recall. At one of the stations, I received a circular telegram. It stated that General Chatilov, Chief of Staff of the Volunteer Army, had illegally quitted his post to go into the rear with General Wrangel. The Commander-in-Chief, therefore, gave orders for proceedings to be taken against him. I received the same telegram at every station. The charge was absolutely false. Chatilov had been authorized to go with me by Denikin himself, in the presence of General Romanovsky. I came up with Denikin's train after leaving Rostov, where we were already at grips with the enemy. I made a verbal report to the Commander-in-Chief on the Caucasian situation. I told him that the Cossacks were not altogether to be trusted, and that it would be much wiser to concentrate all the troops we still had on the Eastern Front, and then try to come to an agreement with the Poles, and if possible, with Serbia and Bulgaria. Also, it was absolutely necessary to hold New Russia won, cost what it might. When I had finished, I gave him a written report, which repeated what I had already said briefly in greater detail. The general had listened to me in silence, and he read the report too without saying a word. I told him that in the circumstances which I had just explained to him, it was impossible for me to perform the task he had entrusted to me. He was still silent. "Then you would undoubtedly refuse the command of the Kubanian troops?" asked Romanovsky. "Yes," I replied, "for I should not be able to succeed, but I am ready to do my utmost anywhere where I can be useful, either in the army or in the rear. I should particularly like to go to the Novorossiysk district if the commander-in-chief intends to fortify it. I think it is urgently necessary to do so." "Certainly not," said Denikin. "To fortify the town now would be to admit the possibility of disaster. It would cause a panic." I saw that it was useless to argue. General Chatilov brought out the circular telegram, of which I have already spoken, read it, and said in a voice which he forced himself to control, "Dare I ask you what this telegram means?" Silence. I lost my temper. "It means that intrigues are still flourishing. That is all." Romanovsky mumbled that there had been a misunderstanding. The commander-in-chief bade us goodbye. "Your Excellency," said Romanovsky, "will you allow General Wrangel to remain for a moment?" When Chatilov had gone, he said, "Were you alluding to me when you spoke of intrigues? You ought to know me well enough to realize that if I had been, I would not have hesitated to accuse you to your face. But I do not know their source, and I do not want to. I merely state facts, and that is enough. Do you want further proof? Think of the telegram concerning my interview with Sidorin and Pokrovsky." "Admit," said Denikin, "that in the present case you are wrong as well as right." He got up and held out his hand. I saluted and left him. Shortly afterwards, General Romanovsky came to tell me that the commander-in-chief had decided that he must fortify Novorossiysk after all, and that he wanted me to do the job. We went to see Denikin together, and in his presence, the chief of staff repeated what he had already said to me. I asked permission to take Chatilov and some officers of my former general staff with me. "I do not suppose the commander-in-chief has any objection," said Romanovsky. Denikin made a gesture of assent. Throughout the interview, he said not a word. It was the last interview I ever had with him. I left the next day. I reached Novorossiysk on New Year's Eve, December 29th, 1919. An icy wind was blowing, as it always does at this time of the year. The town had no fuel whatsoever. The station and sheds were crowded with numbers of refugees who were shelterless and exhausted by fatigue and privations. There was a widespread epidemic of typhus and a shockingly high rate of mortality. Every train took away a fresh load of sick and dead. They were also heaped onto carts and lorries. It made me shudder to see these vehicles full of the dead and dying, with their arms and legs hanging over the sides. General Lukomsky, who was acting as chief of the cabinet, was already in Novorossiysk, together with the other members of the government. The administration of the town was in the hands of a military governor and the commandant of the fort. They were often at loggerheads, which all added to the confusion. With the cooperation of Lukomsky, we set about fortifying the place and drawing up a plan for its evacuation. The colonel in charge of the English mission gave us all the help he could with the evacuation. He introduced me to a member of parliament called Mackinder, who came to see me one day. He asked my permission to speak quite plainly. He showed me a telegram he had received from London, notifying him that Warsaw was talking of a coup d'état to overthrow Denikin. The same rumors named me as his successor. The English government had charged him to find out the truth of the matter. I thanked him for the confidence with which he had honored me, and told him that these rumors had arisen because certain people who wanted to sow discord at any cost had been spreading them abroad for a long time. Sometimes, it is true, I did not share the commander-in-chief's opinions, but that was on strategical questions rather than on political matters, and since I was under his orders of my own free will, I would never, in any contingency whatsoever, act against him. Mackinder asked me if he might communicate my reply to his government. I authorized him to do so. The same day, I sent General Denikin an official account of my interview with Mackinder, together with my answer to his questions. He did not reply. A few days later, General Lukomsky was appointed Governor-General of Novorossiysk. This appointment released me from my task. The struggle between the commander-in-chief and the Cossacks was still going on. A new and recently elected Rada had repealed the laws passed in November and elected General Bukratov as Ataman. He was in open opposition to Supreme Headquarters. This Rada would recognize Denikin only as chief of the troops. It was obvious that we should soon be compelled to leave the Kuban. In the Crimea, as in New Russia, our affairs were going far from brilliantly, and authority was for the most part in the wrong hands. General Slachchov was a very brave and a very energetic man, but he was a slave to morphia and a confirmed drunkard, and quite incapable of holding a responsible position, however small it might be. General Schilling, commander of the troops in New Russia, had no authority over the troops. Public opinion was clamoring for his dismissal and my appointment in his place. General Lukomsky asked me if I would consent to take this command. I told him that I would take any command in which I could be of some use. He communicated my answer to the commander-in-chief, but Denikin refused to appoint me. Shortly afterwards, I received a telegram from General Schilling suggesting that I should act as his adjutant. I did not reply directly, but sent on the telegram to General Lukomsky, adding that, on the whole, I was ready to agree if Denikin gave his authorization, but that I wanted to make sure of this first. The commander-in-chief gave his consent. I arranged to leave on the first boat, which was sailing on January 27th. But in the meantime, we learnt that our troops were already in retreat in New Russia and the Crimea. General Holman showed me a telegram he had just received, saying that Odessa would be in the hands of the Reds in a few hours. That evening, General Romanovsky telegraphed me that it was useless for me to join Schilling at Odessa because, since the town had fallen, the post of adjutant to the commander of the forces had been suppressed. Another telegram from General Denikin canceled my nomination to the post of commander of the Crimean troops. Realizing that the Supreme General Staff most emphatically did not want me, I sent in my resignation on January 27th. General Chatilov followed my example. I left for Yalta, where I had a villa. As we entered Sebastopol, the admiral of the fleet's launch challenged us, and his chief of staff, Admiral Bubnov, came on board. He had come to request me to accompany him to the admiral's quarters, where I would find General Schilling, who had arrived the evening before and wanted to see me. He told me that the evacuation of Odessa had been a veritable nightmare. No measures had been taken to maintain even a semblance of order. In the port, the refugees were killing one another and committing suicide in despair. The section of our army, commanded by General Bredov, had not been able to embark and was trying to get through to Romania. According to him, all the troops were indignant at Schilling's behavior, and Slakshov was powerless to calm them. The Crimea was on the verge of complete disaster. The downfall was now very close at hand. The peninsula was full of fugitives and the debris of various regiments. The governor and the commander of the fortress of Sebastopol had lost their heads. Powerful hostile elements were trying to stir up the people. A certain Captain Orlov, at the head of a fairly large band, had declared war on the local authorities and had adopted as his slogan, "We must put the interior in order before we can beat the Bolshevists." Orlov had suddenly seized the town of Simferopol and imprisoned the chief of staff of the Crimean army and the commandant of the fortress of Sebastopol. The civil governor was powerless and had done nothing. Slakshov had ousted Orlov from Simferopol, and in consequence he had withdrawn into the mountains, whence he was advancing on the town of Yalta. He found many supporters in the country. Thanks to Slakshov, we were still holding the Isthmus of Perekop, which joins the Crimean peninsula to Taurida in the north, but it was obvious that we could not continue to hold it for long. We had suffered heavy losses and had come to the end of our ammunition. My first impression of Schilling was a good one. He was a big, well-built man with a frank expression. He said, "General, I want to speak to you, not in my capacity of general and commander of this place, but as one officer of the guard to another. You probably know what has been happening in Odessa. I shall never be forgiven. I only arrived here today, but I have already realized that they are hostile to me here too. Thus I cannot possibly remain at the head of the troops. I am ready to give up my command to you." I replied that I had already been nominated for the post, but that the commander-in-chief had vetoed my appointment, and that, furthermore, I had sent in my papers and was expecting my discharge at any moment. As Schilling and Nenikoff, the admiral of the fleet, insisted, I added that, even were I appointed, it was obvious that my relations with Denikin would inevitably lead to friction, which would imperil the whole campaign. I found General Mayevsky at my hotel. He told me that the first general order in which I had announced my appointment to the volunteer army had distressed him very deeply. "Why, General, there was not a single word in it to which you could take exception. You declared quite clearly and openly that you intended to be merciless towards drunkards and marauders. You will agree that this was aimed at me." And as I failed to understand, he tried to be more explicit. "You see, in wartime you must leave no stone unturned and neglect no means by which you may achieve your ends. If you insist on the officers and men living like ascetics, they will not fight much longer." I was highly indignant. "Well then, General," he said, "what is the whole difference between the Bolshevists and ourselves?" He answered his own question without pausing, and he thought his answer irrefutable. "Is not the whole difference simply that the Bolshevists have not scrupled about their means and therefore have gained the upper hand?" The next day I met Schilling again. He seemed to be very confused and told me he had decided that his fears had been groundless and that the troops were not hostile to him after all. I assured him that I would forget that we had ever had our conversation of the previous evening. A few days later, I received a telegram from General Schilling announcing that the fortress of Sebastopol had been declared in a state of siege. An hour later came a second telegram with duplicate copies for all the authorities. It begged me to take command of the Alukshta, Bakhchigaray, and Sebastopol areas, and warned the local authorities that in future they were to take orders from no one but me. I telegraphed to General Schilling immediately, saying that in the circumstances it was dangerous to divide the command, and that I could not assent to his proposition nor take any command without the consent of the commander-in-chief. I begged him to cancel the instructions he had given to the authorities. The same day, Captain Orlov published a proclamation to officers, Cossacks, soldiers, and sailors. The whole of the numerous garrison of Yalta has come over to my side, including a company of several hundred men, complete with artillery and machine guns. General Schilling wants to negotiate with me, but I will not enter into any discussion with this man until he has brought to life again all those men whose deaths he caused in Odessa. I hear that our new leader, General Wrangel, is in the Crimea. He is the only man with whom we can and will negotiate. He is the man in whom we all have complete faith. He will sacrifice everything in the struggle against the Bolshevists and those who are corrupting the interior. Long live General Wrangel, the strong man with the mighty soul. I immediately sent the following telegram to Captain Orlov and duplicates to Schilling and the local authorities, urging them to publish it in the newspapers. I have noted the proclamation in which you declare that you submit to my authority, although actually I am holding no command whatsoever. Until recently, the army has been invincible solely because it knew how to obey its leaders blindly. Having forgotten its oath of loyalty, it has come to civil war. We have renewed the struggle of our own free will, and of our own free will, which is equivalent to an oath, we have put ourselves under the orders of our superiors. Neither you nor I have the right to be disloyal to them. Speaking as an old soldier who has served his country loyally all his life, I earnestly beg you to put an end to your rebellion and submit to your immediate superiors. I heard that General Schilling, the commander-in-chief's adjutant, General Lukomsky, the commandant of the fleet, and many others had written repeatedly to Denikin, begging him again and again to appoint me as Schilling's successor, but all in vain. The commander-in-chief was determined not to give his assent. The official newspaper of February 8th published a general order to the effect that Generals Lukomsky, Wrangel, and Chatalov had been cashiered at their own request. Admiral Nenikov, the commander of the fleet, and Admiral Bubnov, his chief of staff, were also cashiered very suddenly. Then Denikin issued an order to General Schilling to arrest all those who had inspired Captain Orlov's revolt, whatever their position or rank might be. Supreme Headquarters had these two orders posted up side by side. Finally, the captain of the English guardship sent me a wireless message from General Holman, worded thus: From R.A., second in command to Marlborough. Cipher. Inform Wrangel destroyer will bring him to Novorossiysk at once. Following from Holman. Holman guarantees his safety and will endeavor to arrange meeting between him and Denikin, but he should not come unless he is prepared to abide by Denikin's final decision regarding his future movements. Wrangel should understand the whole future of Russia is at stake. He must be prepared to state publicly his adherence to Denikin's new democratic policy and sternly discountenance reactionaries now using his name. Holman trusting to his loyalty as enough for length of coming to Novorossiysk. If Wrangel desires, send him destroyer to arrive tomorrow, Wednesday. Inform me time of arrival as soon as possible. By this time, I was incapable of understanding anything of anybody. I requested Chatalov to go to Holman, thank him on my behalf, and tell him that since I had committed no crime, I had no need of guarantees of safe conduct, and that I considered it absolutely useless to vindicate myself to Denikin. Chatalov departed, but returned the next day to tell me that Admiral Seymour, the commander of the English fleet, had told him that General Denikin was demanding, via Holman, that I leave Russian territory immediately. I wrote Denikin a letter. Written as it was in anger, it contained personal allusions here and there, but it gave an accurate history of our misunderstandings. I recalled to him, quoting documentary evidence, the many occasions on which I had warned him of the danger of his irresolute policy and the inevitable consequences of his faulty strategy. I had more than once extricated him from the morass into which his unfortunate opinions had landed him. I wrote that if catastrophe was upon us today, it was not I, but he who was the sole culprit. Since I had left the service, I was no longer constrained to obey him, and he was powerless to force me to do so. But nevertheless, since he imagined that my presence would prevent him from accomplishing his work, I consented to leave Russia of my own free will. I sent copies of this letter to Holman and to all those whom Denikin had dismissed because he had realized that they were my supporters. Chatilov and I left for Constantinople to join my family. In exile, I had never been to Constantinople before, and I was dazzled by its beauty. I spent the days rambling through the town and its suburbs. The English had offered hospitality to my family on the island of Principo, so Chatilov and I went to the Russian embassy, where our military agent put his study at my disposal. The great rooms in the embassy were full of refugees who had come to obtain visas or ask for help and protection. Most of them were absolutely penniless. Americans, Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Italians had all come to the rescue and provided food and shelter for them. We also were penniless, but I managed to obtain a loan from the bank. I did not wish to impose on the generosity of our allies any longer than was necessary, so once I had obtained the loan, I decided to go to Serbia. An incessant stream of refugees was arriving from Novorossiysk. They said that life there was one long hell. The latest comers told us that the town was crowded with troops and refugees. The enemy were shelling the harbor, which was full of the unhappy wretches who had leapt into the water in a panic, only to die there. The commander-in-chief was completely discredited. He had been forced to dismiss Romanovsky, his chief of staff. To appease the public anger, he had replaced him by General Makarov. He had been forced to protect himself with English troops, and on March 14th had boarded a torpedo boat bound for the Crimea. He had been able to evacuate only the volunteer troops, one Kubanian brigade, and some of the troops from the Don. The rest of the Kubanian army and the army of the Don had been abandoned and was retreating to Tuapse along the coast. The day before our departure for Belgrade, the English High Commissioner, Admiral de Robeck, had invited me to lunch. As I was on my way, I received a wireless message from General Holman. It stated that Denikin had decided to give up his command and had summoned a military council at Sebastopol to elect a new commander-in-chief. He requested me to go there and take part in it. This telegram seemed just a little strange to me. I had been dismissed. Denikin had only recently demanded my exile, and here he was summoning me to take part in the election of the commander-in-chief of an army of which I was no longer a member. I could not understand it. I did not learn till later that the dismissal of Romanovsky had not saved the situation, and that public opinion was demanding Denikin's resignation also. He had only two alternatives, either to enter into an open struggle against the generals and superior officers or to resign. General Denikin preferred the second course. We lunched on board the Ajax. I could scarcely keep up the conversation. The telegram so haunted me. I had no doubt at all that disaster was inevitable, and that there was no longer an army. If I returned to the Crimea, I should never come back, and yet I told myself that it was my duty to share the fate of my comrades in arms and to tread the road to Calvary to the end. After lunch, the Admiral invited General Milne, commander of the Army of Occupation, and myself into his study. "I sent you a wireless message from General Holman," he said. "If you wish to go to Sebastopol, one of our ships is at your service. I am very well informed on the Crimean situation, and I know beyond a doubt that you will be called upon to succeed Denikin. I also know the state of the army and the hopelessness of the cause. I doubt whether anyone can save it. I have just received a telegram from the English government. It aggravates the situation considerably. It is addressed to General Denikin, but I cannot conceal its contents from you. I do not want to deal treacherously with you. If you do not learn its contents here and now, it will be too late. Read this before making your decision." He handed me the following note, addressed to General Denikin. The British High Commissioner in Constantinople has been ordered by his government to make the following communication to General Denikin. The Supreme Council of the Allies is of the opinion that, on the whole, the prolongation of the Russian Civil War is the most disturbing factor in the present European situation. His Britannic Majesty's government wishes to suggest to General Denikin that in view of the present situation, an arrangement with the Bulak Soviet government for an amnesty for the Crimean population in general and the volunteer army in particular would be in the best interests of all concerned. The British government is absolutely convinced that the abandonment of this unequal struggle will be the best thing for Russia, and will therefore take upon itself the task of making this arrangement once it has General Denikin's consent. Furthermore, it offers him and his principal supporters hospitality and a refuge in Great Britain. The British government has, in the past, given him a large amount of assistance, and this is the only reason why he has been able to continue the struggle up to the present. Therefore, they feel justified in hoping that he will accept their proposal. If, however, General Denikin should feel it his duty to refuse and to continue a manifestly hopeless struggle, the British government will find itself obliged to renounce all responsibility for his actions and to cease to furnish him with any help or subvention of any kind from that time on. British High Commission. Constantinople, April 2, 1920. England's refusal to give us any help in the future robbed us of our last hope, but I had made up my mind. "Thank you for having warned me, Admiral," I said. "Until this moment I was still hesitating, but now I have no doubts. If I am chosen, it is my duty to accept the command." Admiral de Robeck, obviously much moved, wrung my hand. I decided to leave the same evening, so went to say goodbye to my family. Once again, I must take the opportunity to mention my wife's moral courage. She was certain that I was going to my doom and that we should never meet again, but she made no effort to detain me. She said only that duty was the most important thing in the world. Chatelov was overcome with dismay when he heard of my decision. "You know that it is an impossible fight. The army will either be killed off to the last man or it will capitulate. You will be dishonored forever afterwards. You have already lost everything except your spotless reputation. It would be madness to lose that too." But when he saw that my decision was unalterable, he told me that he was coming with me. We boarded the man-of-war Emperor of India on March 21st and sailed for the Crimea, where, it seemed, the epilogue of the struggle was to take place. The next day, this same man-of-war was to put in at Feodosia to take General Denikin on board. He was leaving for Constantinople without even having bid his troops farewell. The man had been most courageous and quite indifferent to danger in the old days of the Great War, but he had gradually become an altogether different person. He arrived unexpectedly in Constantinople, where his wife was awaiting him, and he and General Romanovsky went straight to the Russian embassy. Whilst he was talking to our military agent, General Agapeyev, Romanovsky waited for him in an adjoining room. When someone went into this room, he found that Romanovsky had been assassinated. Nobody had heard the shot, but an officer and a sister of mercy had been seen hurrying down the staircase. General Denikin's wife, distracted with fear, begged General Holman, who had just arrived, to send some English soldiers to the embassy to guard her husband. Our military agent urged Denikin to prevent our embassy from being occupied by a foreign guard, but in vain. The embassy was occupied and the doors guarded by sentinels. At the Mass for the Dead, which was said that evening, Denikin was present, surrounded by English soldiers. The next day, without paying his last respects to his friend, he left for England. Belgrade, July 31, 1922.